Right. Hello, everyone. It is now 3:13, so I think it's about time to get started while some more people just trickle in. So my name's Gabe Popper, and I guess I can call myself a furry historian. I mostly do talks on furry history in the UK, and recently written and released a book on the subject. And early in the summer, Eurofurence is coming up, and I just thought to myself, well, how about I try doing like a history of the wider European furry fandom? And then about August, I quickly started to regret that, considering how much the scope is. Because, see, that's a map of Europe, and all those little markers there are various conventions that are actively running. And this is an incomplete list. There are some, and it also mentioned it doesn't really include like fur meets and fur dances and any other kind of non-convention type events. But as you can see, there's a lot that spans the entire continent. And the fandom is kind of older than you think. I call it the 32 years of EuroFurries because, yes, the fandom has been going somewhere in Europe for over 30 years. Okay, so let's start way back. So before there were furries, there were religions and stories. A millennia ago, ancient civilizations were either viewed humans with the heads of animals or full-on human-animal hybrids as deities in some form. They would paint them on the walls or carve statues out of wood or ivory, like the one on the bottom right. That's the Lone Man's figurine that was discovered in Germany back in the 1930s. It's believed to be one of the oldest forms of there is at around 40,000 years old. But as time moved on, societies and civilizations would then move their beliefs towards more human and more mystical deities. But storytellers like Aesop use animals to teach morals and values to listeners of all ages, giving animals specific characteristic traits and personalities based on their species that we still use to this day. So even cartoonists and characters like J.J. Grandville and John Tenniel use animals to symbolize aspects of current events and modern culture. And with the advent of comic strips, leads to the creation of funny animals. So while stories have been enjoyed by listeners and readers for centuries, the idea of fans and fandoms enjoying them to the degree of making their own stories set in these creative universes, that's like an early 20th century invention with the likes of Sherlock Holmes or science fiction. While science fiction genre has a wide following throughout Europe, and Japanese anime actually had been distributed throughout Europe before it became even a niche in the United States. Their fandoms wouldn't really evolve to the point of like hosting several conventions until much later. I think Britain was the closest country to having a convention scene in the science fiction area, kind of like the United States, because we had like writers like H.G. Wells, Mary Shelley, Arthur C. Clarke. When it comes to comics, French have a very rich history with the medium. Not much I was to simply say that with furry or anthropomorphic in general. Still, there are some rare standouts on this period, such as the fallout of Rupert, which is a still active fan club based on the Rupert the Bear comics, and it's been around since 1983. As you see that in the bottom left, that was their newsletter. But the fan that we know and love, the fandom that we're all a part of, began in the United States, specifically in the state of California. Fans of science fiction, comic book, and animation enthusiasts who intermingled over a fascination with anthropomorphic animals. The Cartoon Fantasy organization was America's most successful animation fan clubs of the early 1980s, spreading phenomenal Japanese anime across the United States, with some clubs favoring the funny animal animation over others. There was also an underground comics movement that eventually started producing silly, violent, and sexualized funny animal comics that quickly matured into serious anthropomorphic comics, which is where you get the likes of How to Pack Dancer, Usagi Yojimbo, Mephalna, and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Then, in the science fiction conventions, you had funny animal parties, which took place in hotels and had guests watch anthropomorphic animation and read anthropomorphic comics and draw artwork anthropomorphic characters. It was from these parties that ConFurence was formed, beginning with ConFurence 0 in 1989 as an experimental convention, and then a full-on convention the following year. So with it growing in the United States, how did the furry fandom reach Europe? Well, there are a few ways. So whether they be going on holiday or on a work-related trip and just stumbled into a science fiction convention, a few international fans would find themselves curious at the funny animals and make friends with the American furry fans. While we don't have any physical record of who attended, Rod O'Reilly once said that in a panel back in 1999 at ConFurence had a few Australian furry fans as well as one British in attendance, so it was already an international scene that early on. And then we have the few American furries visiting conventions in Europe, such as the World Science Fiction Convention when it was held in 1987 in Brighton, UK. They held a hotel room party. There was also in 1992, a few American furry fans and comic artists traveled to the International Comics Festival in Angoulême in France. And they made a stopover in England. One of the British fans, a man named Ian Curtis, arranged a furry house con inviting them, as well as the few British friends that he knew, over for a weekend together. This meetup kick-started what's called the Yateley House Cons, named after where Ian Curtis lived. And it took place quarterly all the way up until 2019. So 4 times a year up until like 2019, stopping unfortunately because of COVID. And the guests were mostly British, but you did have some from Europe, America, and even New Zealand. But the biggest contributor to how the furry fandom reached Europe, in my opinion, were the indie funny animal comics that were being imported from the United States, such like Albedo Anthropomorphics, Critters, Fantagraphics. These small press comics would have a close-knit fan base, often writing letters to the author or other fans. Some advertised furry fanzines and appers wanting new members, so European fans got to join through there. So, some quick examples. There was an amateur press association fanzine called Furry Press Network that had 1 British member and 2 Italian members, all 3 of which would later transition over to the more popular fanzine Rowbrazzle. There was a Scottish furry named Nick Withers who discovered the fandom through Rudy Pert, a famous funny animal comic. And in the American Journal of Anthropomorphics, there's a mention of a Dutch furry named Ronald van Bokhoven in one of their early 1990s issues. So I also put on the bottom there by accident. This one I give credit to Charlotte for discovering. If you don't know, he runs the Fursuit table at the dealer's den. Apparently, in the very early days of the German furry fandom, it was basically just a small bunch of German students. And one day, one of them was just working in a computer lab and just trying to send messages, when a server accidentally rerouted them to one of the American furry message boards. So independently, they started having their own interest in anthropomorphic artworks and just stumbled into this wider American furry scene. But that was all print, and then everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Yes, things changed thanks to the internet. So furries got involved in the internet very early on with bulletin board systems, or BBSs. It was a text-based communication system where you would type out a message and it would get sent through your phone line to a single server, and then you would get a response back. Because it was only like one single line in, one wire out, it got very slow quickly. So while BBSs were definitely a thing in Europe, it's hard to say if there are any European furries involved in those systems. I know when I talked to Ian Curtis years ago, he said he had a modem for his work. He only ever managed to successfully connect to a BBS system once, and that was only for like a few minutes. In America, they were still a lot more common. The earliest one was called the Tiger's Den, that was operated at a house of Mark Molina and Rod O'Reilly, which was called the Prancing Skill Tear. However, furry BBSs were pretty much replaced in 1990 by a different message board system called Usenet. This one had the advantage of operating on multiple machines, which meant it was a lot more efficient. These groups would use like a fancy address system if you wanted to send messages on a certain board. Early on, Usenets were mostly for like professional work, stuff like medicine, law, politics, and such. But then they introduced a category just called alt, and from then, like the whole floodgates open with potential different boards that you could have. So what ended up having was furries just set up one initially called alt.fan.furry, which is purely just like for furry comic discussions, but then they quickly changed over to one that was more general to furries called alt.fan.furry. And another internet-based one is called Mux. So this was a spin-off of an early online game system called Multi-User Dungeon. The difference between Multi-User Dungeon, which was based like loosely off Dungeons and Dragons, so it was all about exploring worlds and fighting monsters. Mux were purely just for social aspects, so it was all just about exploring worlds and chatting to other people. But yeah, in 1990, there was one created called Furry Muck that grew up wildly popular and is still pretty much active to this day. And in fact, Mucks were so popular with the furry fandom now, so there's, I believe, still an entire genre of Mucks dedicated to furry. There's plenty of them. One of which was a setup run by two Swedish furries, Snaps and Divine Vixen, called SPR, or Socio-Political Ramifications. The name comes from a Tank Vixen's comic. Moving forward, two furry muck users from Britain called Foxy and Prax. They were both brothers. They both discovered the fandom through Furry Muck. They decided to invite some of their friends from the game over for a house con, taking advantage of one of their friends' university accommodation in Colchester, Essex. And they called it UKFurCon. And they would go there and share furry art, they would watch animation, but in particular, because they were at a university, they would sneak into the computer labs and just play Furry Muck on those computers. There were two international attendees for this first event, one from Germany and one from America. The German furry was a guy named Testui Ha, and he used Furry Muck to send messages back to his friends home in Germany. One of them was a man named Unki. And so, years later in 2006, Unki writes recollections about receiving those messages, saying that he was just surprised that Tess suddenly mentioned on Furry Muck that he was just hanging out with British furries that day. And that event basically inspired him to think that they should start a gathering in Europe. As you can see, Unki would later attend the second British FurCon a year later with this fun drawing. He used to draw a lot of his journal entries and post them up on a BCL. But yeah, that's basically how Eurofurence started. It started just from this sudden realization that, yeah, furries can just meet up in person. So going back to Furry Muck, he started talking through the chat and finding as many European members as he could and creating a list of them. Eventually, him and Tev had a list large enough and, inspired by UKFurCon, decided they could try a house con of their own. Unfortunately, the original announcement post on alt.fan.furry was never archived, so the message you see above comes from a reply dated in December 94. At the time, they had already come up with the name Eurofurence as a nod to the Americas' ConFurence. The venue was a farmhouse owned by Tess in Kaiser Wilhelm Kuh, which is across the river from Cuxhaven in northern Germany. And yeah, it's around 60 miles from here. They only expected around 10 people to sign up and attend. And instead, they had 19. So that includes 10 German, 5 British, 1 Swedish, 1 Finnish, 1 Danish, and 1 Dutch. And yeah, the simplest way to describe the first Eurofurence was that it was kind of like a house con. Funny accounts I could find, they mostly knew each other through Furry Muck, and then they got to talk with each other. They got to share furry art. They got to watch cartoons and films. They had meals together, and they took advantage of the summer sun and they spent some time down the North Sea coast. But one thing also the Eurofurence did is that we kickstarted a need for European furries to centralize and have their own discussions. And so that's where the EuroFurries mailing list came about. It was set up by one of the attendees, York. And another way they decided to communicate was through internet relay chat rooms that were starting to become popular. So when American furries started to set up an IRC network called YIFNet, I should quickly add that it was replaced by FurNet in 2001.
Boring.
Yeah, a EuroFurries channel would be set up on FurNet. British furries would also have set up their own called UK FurNet because, I'm sorry, that's kind of what we do as British furries. we make ourselves separate from EuroFurries for some reason. But also, as a quick side note, German furries also have their own separate Usenet group. They're called de.alt.fan.furry, just for more German language specific discussions. But going back to Eurofurence, it was decided that there would be an organization team to plan for dates, locations, and activities, which is kind of important because they had already started to plan their next Eurofurence. So, because of demand, he and his new team of organisers of Eurofurence found Tessa's family farmhouse not big enough. Divine Vixen and staff from Sweden asked planning for arranging the residential areas linked with the university as the venue. But there had been conflicting accounts on whether they were asked to hold Eurofurence 2 in Sweden or they just volunteered. When I was doing research for this, I was able to obtain a EuroFurries mailing list email which just happened to include a message from Snout asking if, quote, anyone objects to some of us arranging it here, with Unky graciously thanking him for the generous offer. So, as far as I'm aware, they volunteered. So, Eurofurence 2 was the closest to having a schedule and the first to having a classic tradition of a video room where there was a program of different animal and anthropomorphic related films on show. And this is the mid-90s, so the films were shown on CRT and played on either VHS tapes or Laserdisc. But there was also a pre-meet held at one of the local furs cabin in Topcores. When I was looking for this up, I noticed it had the name Shale Furries. I'm not sure why. It could be because whoever owned the cabin was named Shale, but I couldn't find that name when I was doing the research for this. But anyway, this pre-meet meetup eventually became a regular thing called Cabin Con, and it would happen every year, including moving to Norway in 2004, and it still carries on this day. So Cabin Con is, by some definition, the second oldest furry con. But that's only if you really consider it a convention. Okay, so here's a simple rundown of how Eurofurence used to be organized. So the Eurofurence Organization Center was where European furries would submit their ideas for dates, locations, t-shirt designs, any activities. And the central organization team would review these propositions, and if they thought they were good, they would then put that idea onto the organization center, and if there was more than one good idea, it would get voted on in a poll. The idea behind the structure was so that the convention would be open and democratic to all who could attend. When it came to the location, anywhere within the European continent was possible. However, you had to consider various factors of eligibility before it could be voted on, such as how big is the venue, how easy is it to get to by transport, how much it would cost in terms of attendees registering. So for instance, Eurofurence 2 was 50 Deutschmarks per person, or around 66 euros in today's money. Plus, the person who proposed the location would most likely act as the convention site liaison, meaning they'd help out with booking the venue, communicating with the staff on behalf of the Eurofurence organizers. So you and your friend had to be serious about wanting Eurofurence to be in your country because you'd be doing a lot of work. Okay, so in preparation for Eurofurence 3, the dates were voted on, the logo was voted on, the t-shirt design was voted on, and so this concept was working pretty well. Then it came to the location. The only problem was that there was only one venue that was deemed suitable, a school building in Bingen. They'd soon discovered that it was unavailable, so Cheetah, chairman of Eurofurence, and Rod managed to save the convention by finding a campsite in Bodstedt in East Germany, at the cost of pushing the convention back from its voted on date in July to August. But it happened. And so this time they were able to expand with an art show and a dealer's den for furries to buy and admire art and comics. There was also only one fursuiter. Yeah, it's hard to believe nowadays, but fursuits were incredibly rare in Europe. At American conventions around this time, there was probably around one fursuit for every 20 attendees, but European fandom was much smaller and didn't have as much of a knowledge base for creating fursuits. So you didn't have the luxury of buying a fursuit from America, which is what most European furries who owned a proper fursuit did at the time. The most efficient way to costume in the furry fandom in the 1990s was either through face paint or to rent a mascot costume from a costume shop. So even Eurofurence 3 made it into the news. And I do not speak German, so luckily I have a translation here in my notes. Internet fans meet in Bodstedt. 58 internet freaks from 11 countries were the guests at a holiday camp Sea Rover in Bodstedt this weekend. Until now, they only knew each other from the computer monitor. This meeting of people who normally communicate through internet groups like d.alt.fan.furry is called Eurofurence 3. After knowing each other across a large distance of a worldwide network, friendships formed and the wish to finally meet each other face to face. After its two predecessors taking place near Cuxhaven and in Linköping, Sweden, this year's Eurofurence takes place at the local Baltic coast. Eurofurence is a spin-off from the largest sci-fi and fantasy conventions in the United States. Yeah, so now I'm just going to take a little bit of a breather while I let Cheezer talk about what furry fandom was like in the late 1990s.
It's very interesting to hear talk about the history of furry fandom because Europe, we are about at the same point as the American fandom was about 10 or maybe 12 years ago. We're just starting. Just last year we had the third annual European convention and we had 60 guests. Now ain't that cute, but you see that we're just starting.
That's how big Zero was for us.
Yes, about 64. The only difference is that it's not a spin-off of another convention or room party, but that it's completely independent. There are no sci-fi or fantasy conventions similar to here in Europe, and it all came to Europe on the internet. So we have a similar situation then with like with Fursuit here. But for Europe, the same. What was Fursuit for the American fandom is GIFnet, the IRC network. And yes, it's still the same thing happening. If there is a convention one a year, if it's in Sweden or if it's in Germany, people come from all over the world simply for 1 weekend. We even have had registration from South Africa, or from Poland, from Finland, from New Zealand, yeah, from Estonia, from everywhere. Because, for example, especially in Germany and in Europe, the internet is almost an all-male domain. So the European furry fandom, people who watch our conventions just say, "Are you guys all gay?"
I don't think that's such a problem.
No, actually, it's not. And but the point is. Because it's such an internet-based thing, there are almost no women.
And certainly different in the United States.
Yeah, basically because the internet has been here longer. Eurofurence 3 had only one female guest, and that was someone's mother.
Who was forced to go.
I mean, I don't really mind, but on the other hand, I think it's a pity.
Well, I think it'll change simply as things
I hope
keep
it will.
going. Yeah.
Well, I think
She's not in the room, is he? Okay, good. Wow. Okay, meanwhile, there were some things happening in the British furry scene around that time. The house cons were still rather active and attracting the occasional international furry. American furries would make another visit to the UK for the World Science Fiction Convention in 1995, this time in Glasgow, where the Scottish fandom had artists like Nick Jardine. There were a few local furry publishing houses also in the UK, like Lazy Fox Studios and the United Publications. And the less Spanish and more lifestyle furries temporarily strayed away from the furry fandom to have their own lifestyle gatherings, such as the UK Furries and the EuroHowl. Meanwhile, in 1998, there were proposals for the next Eurofurence 4 in Norwich, England, Netherlands, Sweden, or Kassel in Germany. What ultimately won was San Marindo's proposed location of the Fursuit campsite in Hees near Eindhoven. The artwork on the top right had some controversy because skunk was also slang for weed. As a result, it was partially censored and used as the back t-shirt design, while another design was used for the front. The demographic of the attendees at the time were from the Czech Republic, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK. Most were German nationality, 6 years old on average, and mostly male, with only one female furry. But thanks to there being more fursuits, there was a fursuit meetup on the Monday, as well as a music jam session. There were also opportunities for all attendees from the 8 different countries to visit some of the local sites, like the Efteling theme park or the Bergen Safari Park. Also, there was the beginning of a drive for more gatherings, not unlike the American counterparts, by taking advantage of Europe's diverse geography and culture. So Europe introduced conventions that didn't have English as its primary language, outdoor skiing and snowboarding events, as well as regular monthly fur meets instead of just the annual or quarterly house cons or the occasional meetup. Speaking of fur meets, actually loan fur meets inspired furries across Britain to set up their own regional groups. This moment is why British fandom has a massive fur meet culture, compared to other countries having fur meets in most of the major cities. Other nations would begin having fur meets gradually throughout the rest of the 2000s as well. Right, let's quickly talk about Lion King. Yeah, it's hard to understate how influential this film was to European furries in particular. It was released worldwide in 1994, and to this day is the highest grossing 2D animated film of all time. And in the 1990s, it was popular enough amongst all ages to have its own Lion King fan clubs. For 2 key examples, so one such was in Western Russia, started around 1998. A group of less than 10 or so Lion King fans who would share their merchandise and watch whatever copy of the film they could get their hands on. One member, Ukiwa, had their own apartment, so everyone would go there to meet up. On Ukiwa's birthday, they decided to make it an annual thing. Meanwhile, Dutch furries have existed before. They didn't really have their own online community until the Lion King came along. Dutch Furs was actually branched off from a Lion King mailing list called Dutch Pride. And just a few members of the mailing list set up the Dutch Furs website as the central hub for furries in the Netherlands. I can't confirm for certain, but it makes sense why the mascot for the Dutch Furs community might be a meerkat. Actually, I think that's a Tabo meerkat, right? With the glasses? Possibly. Okay. So funny enough, I found an old article from a London Furs member called Rexton Crabtree back in 1999, and he stated that there was only one convention of any size in Europe that's known as Eurofurence. I mean, as far as public conventions are concerned, there were 4 as of 1999, if you include the Patten, as well as Method Fermi and RustCon. That being said, Eurofurence was the only large convention, as well as the only one that over the next few years that actually attracted international attendance. RustCon only just started, and the attendees were from either Moscow and St. Petersburg, and Method Minicon was predominantly German. But all of them would grow. And yes, as you can probably see, in the second RustCon also had a real lioness as one of its guests. Russia. Okay, so apparently in Russia, you could rent a tame and trained wild cats from circuses for a day. And they behaved more like calm house cats, except that they were noticeably bigger. And another thing you can notice on the top right, that you have some puppets there, or specifically some paw pets, because Eurofurence 6 was the first to technically have a paw pet show. So paw pets were one of the American things. It was mostly popularized by the Fun Paw Pet Show, which was a weekly internet puppet show in the United States. There were other branches of the paw pet shows, one of which was Paw Pet West, which a German fan named Fairlight got inspiration from to create the first Eurofurence Paw Pet Show, which was, at the time, was only known as Lionel Scritchy's Dormitory, or LSD for short. This was a simple puppet variety show that was more in the vein of comedic sketches with audience participation in its second half. Also, like the American Paw Pet shows at the time, these used single-handed animal puppets, we wouldn't see the corpets of the more modern variety, which required like 2 hands, until like at least a decade later. Okay, so as you see, all the conventions also grew. Eurofurence taking place in a castle for the first time, combining a few of their entertainment pieces like the puppet show and the bird dance into medieval madness. And RusCon taking place at the Ava Events Center, and this time they had a frickin' leopard. Also, this is where Method Minicopters reached max capacity at their initial Postal site, so in the following year they had to move. EuroFurries by this point was getting even closer to a traditional furry convention, and this time having a theme and a guest of honor. Good old Uncle Carving. And yes, RusCon had a line cut. His name was Prince. Alright. So if you didn't notice, EuroFurence had spent the past 4 years in different parts of Germany, although not without trying, as locations in other countries were either outvoted or deemed unsuitable by the EuroFurence organizational staff. Someone or some people weren't happy with this and demanded that EuroFurence should be taking place in a different European country each year. Who was making this demand? Well, there are theories, but without access to the original message board tags or mailing list emails, we can't say for certain. I think I heard someone say French. Yes. Yeah, see, I've heard that theory in particular, and I'm actually currently researching this part of history, so we might get a proper answer certain. French, in my opinion, possible, but it's kind of unlikely. I've spoken to at least 2 French furries at the time. Neither were even aware that a French person was making these complaints, and were actually more comfortable with Eurofurence being in Germany. They felt it was like more central, and at the time, the French furry fandom only had like maybe 20 or so members. So if they wanted to host their own convention, they felt like it was rather they go their own way than rely on Eurofurence. But there are other theories. I think it's actually British. I have my reasons, mainly because I was like one British trainer in particular who was like really trying hard to get Eurofurence in England. And as you can see before, there were attempts to try and get Eurofurence in England that failed. But again, I'm only saying it as a theory. But what we do know for certain is that there was another demand for Eurofurence to take place outside of Germany, that the organization team decided to open submissions for Eurofurence 9's location early. The EF staff weren't obliged to host outside of Germany, but if a good location was suggested, they'd happily take it. We don't know how many submissions there were. Despite what the text says, the event schedule for Eurofurence 8 didn't mention any kind of event to propose any certain locations, and I couldn't really find any photos of the supposed bulletin board to see what submissions existed. But shortly after the con, there was one thread on alt.fan.furry that rumored one country was chosen. This would be confirmed in the following year to be the Czech Republic. And as you can see, attendance dropped for the first and only time in Eurofurence history. This Eurofurence is infamous for its technical issues, from faulty microphones to electrified tent poles, to apparently cramped conditions in the Postal and disgusting state of the nearby river. So Uncle Cargrave, who, as you knew, was guest of honor back in Eurofurence 8, he loves talking about Eurofurence 9 in the story hours.
Not this year.
Fortunately, he didn't this year. And as you can see in the photos, is seen here drunk off wine and dancing with cheese with his shirt off. But to give them credit, the Eurofurence and Czech organizers made it work remarkably well. So despite all the jokes about technology, yeah, you can thank Uncle Cargay for that one. But yeah, here's one of the wild facts I found out when doing the research. Eurofurence 9 was the first Eurofurence to have wireless internet access. So yeah, to be more technical, 8 was the first to introduce what's an internet room, because back in the early days, your internet was like so primitive that you needed to have a literal computer set up in this specific room if you wanted to go online and send messages while at the con. But yeah, Altair, who was one of the tech furs on the EF19, he rented a satellite terminal instead of a wireless access point that could be used throughout the site. When I was talking to him, he told me that it was the same kind of kernel that CNN used to cover the Desert Storm operation in Iraq. Yeah, take that back how you will. That would be the last time Eurofurence took place outside of Germany. As far as I can find, EF10 was the last Eurofurence to have a submitted location. And ever since, every Eurofurence has both stayed in Germany and stayed at a single venue for consecutive years. From the Nuremberg Castle, to the Ringberg, the Magdeburg, to the Estrel, and now today, the Congress Center in Hamburg. But the Estrel was immortalized in virtual reality for Eurofurence Online 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic forced almost every convention to cancel and go virtual. But there are several reasons why Eurofurence abandoned the constantly changing venue and voting on location model. There was legal issues with transporting equipment across borders. Most European furries are actually quite accepting of staying in Germany because continent-wise, Germany is fairly central. Although by this point, with the number of conventions appearing across Europe, it's also kind of unnecessary. See, some countries saw running a convention outside of Germany being possible as the motivation to try out their own convention. This was the case with French furries, who established the FurSuit online space in 2001 and discussed having their own furry convention instead of pitching their location for Eurofurence. When EF9 was announced, the French furries kickstarted their first convention, ConFurence, which took place at the home of Ozon Grifox in May 2003 and took place at castles in the following years. The Czech Republic, knowing that they could hold their own convention after EF9, eventually started their own with Chase Thank you, Chess which continues annually to this day, starting in Hostel and gradually increasing to being at the Skalski Dvor Hotel in the Bohemian Moravian Highlands. Other countries in the Eastern Bloc would be inspired to host their own gatherings too. For instance, Ukraine began having fur meets in Lviv on New Year's Eve in 2005 with 11 in attendance, some of whom had met when attending Eurofurence. We also got new kind of events, as despite furries and fursuit dancing to DJ sets having been around since the days of ConFurence, the first ever fur dance event took place in Cologne in 2008 and ran biannually until 2016. Although not without inspiring other fur dances to take place across the world to this day. Some noteworthy countries. Poland started having a furry community of their own in around May 2002. The Pole Furs began having their own major gatherings at a major music festival in 2005, which, though not a convention per se, first off was a multi-day event with furry activities. Gdansk Convent, or GDAPCon, started off as an annual fur meet in an apartment in Gdansk in 2007, and a year later, Fursuit which literally means furry con in Polish. Thank you. As a full-fledged convention. GDAPCon would become a full convention in 2011, and FursuitCon would replace FursuitCon in 2012, the latter taking place in the winter and having a more interactive story-based program, while the former takes place nearer to the spring and has a more of a Western-style program. So with all this expansion in mainland Europe, what about the United Kingdom? So outside of the fur meets spreading into every major city in the United Kingdom, they actually had difficulties hosting their own convention. There was a failed attempt to run a furry track at an anime convention in 1999, and at least 4 known attempts to start up their own convention between 2002 and 2006, along with many discussions about holding Eurofurence. It became a demoralized running joke for a while to mock or disregard any future discussions of a British furry convention. So that meant that even in 2006, when a website popped up for a new furry convention being organized by some NordicFuzzCon called ConFuzzled, went online, the consensus was that the convention wouldn't actually happen. But then it had secured a youth hostel in Manchester and opened for registration in 2007 and hosted 136 attendees in 2008. It's moved to Hinckley and now takes place in Birmingham as Britain's largest furry con. It's also the con that I'd argue invented the furry convention mascot. See, conventions before obviously used anthropomorphic characters on their con books and any related artwork, But Brock the Badger is a specific character made as ConFuzzle's mascot, and even debuted in Fursuit in 2012. Meanwhile, London Furs had a boat party as part of its, at the time, traditional winter event in 2006, and it became so popular that it became its own event in 2007, and a full furry convention in 2008. 2008 also marks the debut of the first UK fur dance event, better known as Frantic Euphoria, which ran until 2014. Even Scotland had its own furry convention with ScotiaCon running in 2011 and currently taking place in Glasgow. In the 2010s, web forums and mailing lists were being taken over by social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, etc., etc. Along with the furry family gaining awareness through more mainstream platforms, the presence of more internationally friendly furry conventions meant individual countries gaining enough of a following to bring conventions to their home nations, including some that Eurofurence would host years like the Netherlands with Furry Week in Holland and Sweden with NordicFuzzCon. Actually, I should add that Sweden did technically have a furry convention back in 2009 that was simply called FurryCon, but I completely missed that when I was initially setting up this presentation. Right, here are the debut conventions of the latter half of the 2010s, where we see a huge wave of furry events appear across both the East and Western Europe. For instance, there were a few Spanish furries who used furry muck back in 1995, though I couldn't find hard evidence for their presence for decades. When I talked to a few Spanish furries at Fernion this year, they told me that they had spent more of their time engaging with the Latin American furry community, particularly in the mid-2000s. But with social media bringing more awareness of furries in Europe as a whole, that led to them growing immediately having their own furry convention and fur meets. Even the Republic of Ireland, which had a small and scattered presence of the furry family in the 2000s, and fur meets beginning in 2009, had its first furry convention just a few weeks ago. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic caused a lot of conventions to either go virtual or roll back for 2 years or just cancel entirely. See, I feel kind of bad for Hungary because, as you can see, they had their first convention in February of 2020. And although they tried to hold on, postponing their 2021 convention, they've eventually had to cancel. I don't know if they're still doing fur meets, but I do hope that they do bring back their convention. So, where are we now? Well, I'm sure all of you know that about what conventions are in Europe right now, but not to mention any fur meets, parties, and outdoor activities across this continent, Eurofurence, for instance, isn't the only furry convention in Germany. Some of them I noticed actually captured the spirits of the past Eurofurence, like some taking place in youth hostels or castles, or these took place in the Ringberg for a couple of years. This also doesn't include their fur meets, which I'm aware happened in like a few cities like Berlin, as well as the furry dance parties or fur dances, which...
Also, CastleCon is not a castle, it's actually a camping con that was originally near a castle.
Oh, okay.
And today it's on another camping site of the further away from that, but we still go to like a medieval event every year. That's at the same time.
It should take place in the castle, though. Someday it will. ConFuzzle and ScotiaCon in the UK are joined by furry camping events like Festival and fur dances like Club Animals and New Horizons, as well as some more conventions that mostly appeared in the mid-2010s when ConFuzzle was considered overcrowded, back when the attendance would reach just over 1,000. So with our neighbour, the Republic of Ireland, now having a furry convention, all we need now is a furry convention in Wales and Northern Ireland to complete our British Island set. British Isles set, I mean, sorry. So FranceFurence was unfortunately short-lived, but there are regular furries posted on the FranceFurence website. Firstly, Blacklight, which originally began as a small meetup at an activity centre where you could play like mini-golf in a UV-lit arena, hence the name Blacklight. It quickly became an annual gathering that built itself up to a convention, and it was the only one until 2019 when Fantastic began in Lyon. I actually registered for Fantastic in 2020 and eventually travelled to participate in 2022. And the next thing I found that they have 3 more conventions, so well done. Here in the Netherlands, which held Dutch FurCon a month or two ago. Czech Republic has a bunch still going on. Going back to mascots, Zodia has an interesting idea on them by having a different one each year based on the zodiac sign. So when it debuted in 2011, its mascot was the ram based on Aries. The following year, it was the bull for Taurus, zebra for Gemini. I think it did have a break from tradition at one point a year. I'm not sure if it returned to that theme, but I think it's quite neat. Right, so Russia. So Ruscon changed its branding to Eurofurence in 2004 and continues to take place annually in Moscow until at least 2019. Eurofurence 2020 was likely cancelled due to COVID, and I've not seen any evidence of its return. They also used to have a camping event in Siberia until 2019 as well. So as of writing, the only active convention there is CityCon, which takes place each year since 2014 at a summer resort outside of Moscow. And since I mentioned Russia, I should also bring up Ukraine. So about New Year's Eve for me that I mentioned earlier, although returning to New Year's Eve in 2006, it expanded into its own convention called moving to Kyiv and moving to the spring to reconcile with Victory Day on May 9th, which is an Eastern European holiday celebrating the surrender of Nazi Germany. They would rebrand in 2012 under the acronym Wild Ukrainian Furry Fun, or WOOF, and bring inspiration for 2 or more furry conventions in the country. One in Kharkiv in 2012 called KharCon, which is a more relaxed convention format, and one in Lviv called Lviv that started its fur meet in 2015 before becoming a con in 2017. Wolf, however, had been on hiatus after 2018 because of the national safety concerns at the country's border. The Lviv KharCon continued until the COVID-19 pandemic, and unfortunately with the subsequent invasion from Russia and the ongoing war, none of them were currently active. When I was in the dealer's den, I was told that apparently Wolf is planning on rebranding and hopefully returning once the war's over, whenever that is, so all the best for them. But yeah, there are also still many, many more conventions and fur dances across Europe. I probably couldn't fit any more on the slide, and considering that I keep on finding leaflets around the con with more of the events popping up, God, it's funny. I didn't even know Slovenia was having a furry con until like a week before I come to Europe.
Are you a for European cons?
I am now.
So you can check the channel for existing events.
That's good to know. Just to quickly go over the few examples I already have here. So Horizon is Italy's current furry convention. Lakeside Furs is in Australia. Previously, Sorry.
We have a fit t-shirt in all the souvenir shops in Vienna for you.
Let me repeat. Lakeside Furs is in Austria. And interestingly, this one was previously run by Unki of the Eurofurence fame. For Nadia, Norway, we have Snowtails and Golden Lee's Con in Switzerland, and Iceberg Cabin in Iceland. Okay, so if you go back to 1990 and 1991, when the furry fandom had begun in Europe, I'd say there were around 10 or 20 furries, just based on how many of them were members of like fanzines and Furry Month. Around 8 years ago, someone actually had managed to archive a message board that Unki hosted on Furry Mug starting around 1995. So we know that on the game, there were at least 86 European members. And when you factor in that not every furry played Furry Mug, even back then, I'd argue that the European furry population was somewhere in the low 100s. While Eurofurence in 2000 had like 160 attendees, I also know it was reported that London Furs had over 140 members alone. So it's possible that there were a few hundred. As of this year, the attendance of the big free furry conventions in Europe are over 2,000 each, with Eurofurence being close to 4,000. Given some of its roots were in Furry Month, and furries have had the tendency to be ahead of the curve with where online space and social medias are getting, it's fair to say that the internet helps a lot with bringing people into the furry fandom. However, I'd like to give more credit to the people who get furries off the computers and come to events. like this, where we made the furry fandom a friendly, creative place for everyone. So with the Portugal show and the closing ceremony starting in around an hour, all I have to ask is that you give your thanks and support to the people who run the convention and all conventions across Europe, because some of them have been part of Fandom for around 30 years. So yeah, that's all I had to speak. Just forgive me for doing a bit of promotion, but if you want to learn specifically about the British furry fandom and its history, I would really recommend you check out my book. It's a subject I've researched on for like 6 years, and 3 of them were spent just working on this book alone. There might still be a few copies left to buy at the Fursuit table on the dealer's den. Otherwise, the best way to order a copy is through the publisher website that you see in the URL below. It's also available on Amazon if you want to buy it that way too. I've also got to give praise to both Eurofurence and NordicFuzzCon for putting the effort to digitally archiving their con books, their websites, and even videos of their past conventions. It makes looking into their history a lot more accessible. Same goes with other furry archives and people who post old publications online. I had to use Wayback Machine a lot, and it's very difficult finding some of this info images because of it. So,
also with a funny fact, when I was young, I'm now 32, but when I first saw furries, I was almost 13 years old. And back then you have not like a lot of input stuff to find furries. And I still remember that I was at Disney World, and I knew as a kid that there were Fursuit is not Disney characters, even though I didn't know what was furries. And then after 2 years later, I just said, what is this? And then you had like YouTube 1 year or 2 years only, and I did animal costuming. And that was like the first time I saw an Entropon video and an old Eurofurence stand video, and that is how I discovered them.
oh, very nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I discovered it through exploring DeviantArt. I guess I'm not the only one. But yeah, so to say thank you all for listening, and I can only apologize I didn't cover this convention or that country, or I yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Europe is a pretty large continent. If you have any questions or comments, now's the time to give them. Otherwise, I know some of you are eager to get into the queue for the closing ceremony. I don't blame you.